A couple of weeks ago, I met with this potential client. He ended up not being a client because he fell into one of two categories. And I learned a long, long time ago when I started to hire myself out to potential clients as a copywriter that there's two types of people that are entrepreneurial minded, and to a greater extent there's two types of people that you will find everywhere. When I first started selling my services as a copywriter, I would love one type of client. They had some kind of business. They were able to make some product or service. They were able to sell their product or service, and they wanted to sell their product or service to more people so they could make more money, so they could expand your business. And I would write a sales page. I would use all my skills in psychology and hypnosis and hypnotic language patterns and linguistic presuppositions, and I would write the perfect or the ideal sales page that would best promote their products to the world. Then together we would tweak it to increase the sales. That was where both our focus was how to increase the sales. And they loved this. They loved how much I could help them make a ton of money to expand their business. And it gave them a lot of satisfaction, a lot of personal satisfaction to see the results of their efforts out in the world, making people happy, getting reciprocal income, and increasing everyone's pleasure. But then there was another type of client, and at first I didn't know what it was about these types of people that I didn't mesh with, and it took me a while, but I finally figured it out. I would use the same techniques. I would use the same hypnotic language patterns and linguistic presuppositions that I knew would increase their business, but they wouldn't really like the sales page, and they kept asking me to rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it. And after a few of these clients, I realized what the problem was. They had this deep need to be recognized for their ego. And there were two types of people that these people kind of slowly filtered into. The one type that had a very kind of clear transition between their inner ego, what they thought about themselves on a subconscious level, and how they expressed this in the world. And they got a lot of satisfaction by how they expressed their ego into the world through products or services. And so long as they were getting a lot of interactivity between happily paying customers and the expressions of their ego, they were happy. But this other group of people, they weren't like this. They had this weird kind of disconnect between their inner ego and their outer expressions. It was as if their outer expressions were a very, very uncalibrated ego flex, and they wanted to be recognized for how awesome they were, but in a way that didn't really connect with what they produced on the free market, on the sales market. And so these people, they only really liked the sales pages that highlighted how awesome the creator was. Like if you had some guy that had a bread shop, he wanted to highlight how awesome the bread was, how delicious the bread was, how cheap the bread was, how fresh the bread was. And that was enough, and that was enough to sell a lot of bread, and both of us would be happy. But these other people, if they had a bread shop, for example, they didn't really care about talking about their bread. They wanted me to kind of highlight how awesome they were because they were a bread maker, and they wanted to talk about their own personal story about, look at me, look how awesome I am, look at me, look how awesome I am. And this is the difference between most people that I started to meet as potential clients. People that said, look how awesome this product is. You can buy this product and gain happiness. But these other people, they always had this deep need to be seen for how awesome they were without being connected to anything they produced in the world. And this is basically the two kinds of people you'll see today. The people that produce things in the world, and these things they produce, their communication, their language, they make other people happy. They make other people satisfied. And that's enough. But these people, they need to be seen for how awesome they are, and it's not really connected at all to what they produce. And these are the people that the more successful they get from a business standpoint, the angrier they get. The more they start to hate their customers, because their customers are buying all their products, but they still feel kind of neglected on an inner ego standpoint. And this is the kind of people that become billionaires, but they're never satisfied. They have this deep need to be recognized for how awesome they think they are, but there's no connection between how awesome they think they are, how much they want to be recognized for their inner awesomeness, and the stuff they produce. So the more money they make, the more they feel this disconnect, and the angrier they get. Unfortunately, these are the kinds of people that run the world right now, which is one of the reasons why we're so fucked. But it's kind of the same structure kind of exists in a therapeutic setting, where you go to a therapist and you have this presenting problem, and the presenting problem is really an externalized version of the deeper problem. And unless you're willing to look inside yourself, unless you're willing to do some serious introspection, you'll never really discover what this inner problem is. It's kind of the same dynamic. Inner ego, outer expression, and there's this massive disconnect. So after a few minutes conversation with this guy, I kind of realized that I didn't want to do business with him because he was this second kind of person. But was the most fascinating part of this story, which is why I'm telling you this story, is the guy he brought with him. He brought with him this consultant, and I could tell that the consultant didn't really know this guy very well because their communication didn't have a lot of rapport, but this consultant was a fascinating person because of the people he had dealt with, because he was the kind of person that was always researching psychological techniques. He always wanted to learn more about hypnosis. He always wanted to learn more about how people tick. He always wanted to learn more about human psychology and human instincts so he could figure out better ways to persuade people in a way so everybody's better off. And he told me this story about this guy that he worked with a few years ago. And this guy had this super genius idea. He started off being a consultant for the military way back in the day. And he developed this subliminal acoustic broadcasting system. And he came up with a way to embed subliminal programmings on carrier waves that were below the threshold of human understanding. So they would blast out these carrier waves that humans couldn't hear, beneath the range of human hearing, but embedded in these carrier waves were these subliminal messages, and he did this for the military. And before an army or a military would invade another country or invade someone else's territory, they would blast out these carrier waves with these subliminal messages that were built into the carrier waves that would create massive dread and massive fear and massive terror. And they would blast these out for weeks, months even, before they invaded. And so the enemy soldiers, the enemy military, sometimes the enemy civilians would have these carrier waves they couldn't hear being blasted 24/7 with these embedded subliminal messages that would create massive fear and dread and terror, and we're going to die and the devil's knocking on our door and all these terrible thoughts, and give them nightmares. So when they did start the invasion, they would just give up right away. And this was a very, very powerful technique. The problem was the military wanted him to apply the same technology to civilian populations in the United States, just to experiment with how they could move people by embedding these subliminal messages. Now, the problem with this is if you just want to blast a bunch of subliminal messages, it's very, very difficult to create positive outcomes, but it's very, very easy to create negative outcomes, because that's how our brains are wired. Our brains are wired in a better safe than sorry instinctive standpoint, so we're always kind of low-key looking for potential danger, because that's what helped us survive back in the day. So when they blast these subliminal messages that create massive fear and dread in the audience, it's very, very easy because it kind of resonates with our instinctive programming. It's a lot more difficult to blast messages that create positive feelings and certain specific actions. And so he didn't really like the idea of just blasting negative messages in the civilian population to try to get them to do this or do that or do whatever, or vote for this candidate or be obedient tax-paying citizens. Or if you don't pay taxes, you'll die a horrible death, stuff like that. And so he kind of noped out of this experimental program, but he wanted to continue this research. He wanted to find out how to use subliminal messages to program people's brains in a positive way. He wanted to figure out how to use hypnotic programming to program people's brains, to get them to behave in a positive way. And so he did all this experimentation, and because you understand this more than most people, you probably see what's coming because you understand how subliminal messages really work. Because of your experience, somebody like you, compared to most people, understands how subliminal messages work. A lot of people have this false idea that we're being blasted by subliminals and we're kind of helpless and we're just going to be obedient slaves to the subliminal messaging. But they need to be presented. The subliminal messages, the subliminal advertising needs to be presented within a proper context for them to work. Somebody like you already knows this, and this is what he discovered. For example, the famous Coke and popcorn experiment. They had a movie theater. They did this back in the 50s, and they put visual subliminals on the screen. Buy popcorn, buy popcorn, buy popcorn, buy Coke, buy Coke, buy Coke. And that had a statistically significant increase in popcorn and Coke sales. But this was in a very specific context. The people they were blasting these subliminal messages to probably had in the past been in that same theater and they bought popcorn. They had probably in the past been in that same theater and bought Coke. And they were also in a scenario where other people around them were buying Coke and buying popcorn, so they could smell the popcorn. They could hear the people drinking Coke. So it was a very, very specific context. They probably had a physical anchor to the location where they remembered being in a movie theater, seeing the screen, and eating popcorn. So when they saw the messages, buy Coke, buy Coke, buy Coke, buy popcorn, buy popcorn, buy popcorn, it seemed very familiar. So he wanted to create another situation like this where he could control the context and control their whatever anchors they had, and then blast subliminal messages, the same type of technology, subliminal messages embedded into carrier waves that are beneath the range of human hearing, and see how well they worked. And he did this, and it was an absolute genius idea. He got a job, or he started working as an Uber driver, because while he was driving in his Uber, he could control the conversation, and he had a series of criteria. He would just start talking to his passengers, and if the conversation went into a certain direction, he would flip a switch and blast them with these acoustic sub-listening threshold, acoustic embedded subliminal programming. And for the first part of the experiment, he would talk to people about their jobs, about what they did. And if they were forthcoming enough with the conversation, he would ask them questions about financial success. He would ask questions about financial success. He would ask them questions about their best experiences in some kind of business setting. And the people that started talking about their successes, people that were like salespeople that talked about the best sales they ever had, people that had decided to sell things to people in a very persuasive way, people that had a lot of experience being able to sell things to people and make a lot of money in sales. As soon as they started talking about their sales success, he would flip on the subacoustic subliminal programming and blast messages like, you are successful. Because you're successful, you are so generous. Being generous causes success. Being friendly causes success. You love to be successful. You love to be generous. You love to help other people. You love to communicate with other people. You love to share with other people. You love to share yourself with other people. When you share yourself with other people, it makes you feel fantastic. When you share yourself with other people, it makes you feel alive. When you share yourself with other people, it makes you feel on your purpose. When you share yourself with other people, it makes you feel outgoing and confident and charismatic. And when he played these messages for at least 5 minutes, that was his criteria. Step 1 was to get the conversation flowing. Step 2 was to get the conversation flowing where they started talking a lot about their business success. Step 3 was to blast these subliminals for at least 5 minutes. And when all three of these criteria were satisfied, he would measure the results. And the results he measured were how much of a tip this person left, because they couldn't control how much they paid for the ride because that was set up through Uber. But the people that he played this message to for at least 5 minutes, the average tip they left was $87. Now, I don't know if you've taken Uber before, but usually when I take an Uber, the most I ever give as a tip is $5, and that's when it's a really good ride. But these people, their average tip when he played the subliminal messages for 5 minutes was $87. And he was getting 3 or 4 of these tips a night when he drove his Uber. So he was making an easy 6 figures by subliminally programming the passengers in his Uber car. And so he wanted to take this to the next level. He wanted to test this out with sexually suggestive subliminal messages. But it turns out there's a lot more variables and it's a lot harder to measure. When you subliminally program, when you hypnotize somebody to give you a big tip, when you hypnotize somebody to give you money, when you hypnotize somebody to pay you a lot of money, it's very easy to measure. But if you want to hypnotize somebody to have sex with you or hypnotize somebody to feel sexual attraction, this is a lot harder to measure. But he did have the same amount of success. Instead of talking to people about their business success, he would talk to women about their sexual desires, not blatantly, but their desires in their ideal husband or their ideal boyfriend. And he would wear a wedding ring, even though he wasn't married. And he would have pictures in his car of his wife and kids, even though they were made up and he wasn't married. And he would make them feel comfortable. He would make other people feel very comfortable. He would make other people feel very comfortable. And then he would talk to them about their romantic desires, about what it's like in the dating market. How do you find your boyfriend? How did you find your last boyfriend? And if they were forthcoming enough, if they talked about their not sexual, but their romantic experiences, not blatantly sexual, but sexual as a subtext of the conversation. If they were forthcoming enough talking about their boyfriends, talking about their ideal boyfriend, etc., he would flip on the subliminals and the subacoustic beneath human range of hearing embedded subliminal messages that said things like, because you are confident, you are sexually outgoing. Because you are confident, you are romantically outgoing. It is safe for you to express your sexual interest. It is safe for you to express your sexual desire. It is safe for you to express your romantic interest. It is safe for you to explore your sexuality. It is safe for you to have sex with strangers. It is safe for you to have sex with strangers. And he would blast these messages. Now, he couldn't measure the results like he could measure how much of a tip somebody gave, because expressing sexual interest is a lot more difficult than just leaving a tip on the Uber app. But the people that he had the same criteria, where he got the conversation flowing for at least 5 minutes and he flipped on the subliminals for at least 5 minutes, these young women suddenly changed their behaviors. It was a lot more subtle, and it wasn't something that you could specifically measure in a scientific setting, but they changed their behavior and they started giving him openings so he could exploit those openings into a sexual encounter, meaning they would change their destination on the Uber app going back to their apartment if they live by themselves, and they would come up with some kind of excuse to stop and wait, where she would come up and come back, and she would say something that would suggest she wanted him if he were willing to make a move to go with her back up into her apartment. But they were very, very subtle. They weren't blatant. They weren't saying, hey, let's have sex. Let's come up to my apartment and have sex, Mr. Uber driver that I just met. They would say something like, I'm going to go grab something out of my apartment. Do you mind waiting? And the conversation would kind of linger. She would change the direction or the destination on the app. They would go to her place if she lived by herself. This only worked if she lived by herself or she knew her roommates were at home. They would go back to her place, and she would kind of have a conversation before she went into an apartment where she would wait, where the Uber driver would wait, and she would come back, and she would say things during the conversation which would indicate she wanted him to kind of make a move and go with her to her apartment. And there were always these different, very subtle clues. It wasn't something so obviously and easy to measure as giving somebody a tip or saying, hey, let's go have sex. But it changed their behavior. These subliminal messages changed their behavior, so they were very, very blatant. If you know what to look for, they were very, very blatant in giving him an opening to go with her. He never followed through. But this was a significant change in their behavior by getting them speaking in the context of their ideal partner, by getting them to speak in the context of their ideal romantic partner, and then blasting them with subliminal messages. That changed their behavior. So they engineered the situation. These young women would engineer the situation to give you an opening to go with them to their apartment so you could have a sexual encounter. He never followed through, but the more he studied this, the more he started to see this everywhere. And this was the most fascinating part of the conversation. And another reason why I didn't want to do business with this guy was because he wasn't interested in this. He was just interested in talking about himself. And this is another thing that you'll find about the two people you'll meet in the world. Some people are just fascinated by human nature. Some people become keenly interested in human nature, how other people behave, how other people do things, how other people think. Because if you understand how other people think, if you understand how other people do things, you can get into their brain and come up with some type of hypnotic language patterns or linguistic presuppositions and kind of alter their behavior to create mutually beneficial relationships. But this guy wasn't really interested in that because he was only interested in talking about things that led to him getting some kind of ego gratification, some type of ego, look at me, how awesome I am, ego validation. And that's another reason. And once you see this dichotomy, people that like to express themselves to create interactions with others versus people that say, look at me, look at me, look at me, and everything they do is kind of an attempt at a flex, you'll start to see these two people everywhere. But the more I talked to this guy, the more I wanted to understand how you can talk to people, how you can set up the right context. You can set up the right conversational context. And once you have this conversational context set up, then you can embed some hypnotic language patterns. You can embed some linguistic presuppositions. You don't need to use subliminal programming. You only use subliminal programming if you have the tech available, but you don't need to use subliminal programming. This was the next step of his research. You set up the conversation. You set up the context of the conversation. You get the other person talking. So long as they're talking, and you're doing most of the listening within this preset context, you can drop in a ton of hypnotic language patterns. You can drop in a ton of linguistic presuppositions. You can drop in a ton of blurred reality embedded quotes and put ideas in their head. And once you set up the right context of the conversation for business or sex or love, and you put in the ideas in their head using hypnotic technology, you can gain an enormous amount of financial and sexual and romantic success.